Every day, organizations collect masses of information about their customers, clients, and partners and analyze that data in the hope of becoming more efficient, more effective, and ultimately of selling more stuff. The more information we might think, the better. But is big data always better? What assumptions and biases are built into big data? And how can organizations use large data sets without reproducing those biases? Welcome to a live-streamed episode of The Big Question, Chicago Booth Review's panel discussion series. Today's episode is being filmed in collaboration with the James M. Kilts Center for Marketing at Chicago Booth and the Nielsen Company. Nielsen relies on the Kilts Center to distribute ad intel data to nearly 500 academics who use them to explore research questions. I'm Hal Weitzman, and I'm joined by an expert panel. Jean-Pierre Dubé is the James M. Kilts Distinguished Service Professor of Marketing and Director of the Kilts Center for Marketing at Chicago Booth. Mainak Mazumdar is Chief Data Officer at the Nielsen Company, the marketing research firm, and an advisor to the U.S. Census Bureau. And Susan Paddock is Chief Statistician and Executive Vice President at NORC at the University of Chicago, a non-partisan research organization. Panel, welcome to The Big Question. Mainak Mazumdar, let me start with you. Let's define our terms, and particularly in your case at Nielsen, what is big data and where does it come from?
Yeah, good question. Big data, we consider big data is the data that comes from digital signals. That can be data coming from your mobile devices that you consume day to day or your computers. There are instances where we look into beyond that, like it can be smart television where you are streaming your content and media as well. And folks would also consider data that's captured by camera or RFID or even audio as well. And Internet of Things is another area that a lot of data gets collected. So all these signals that human behavior when you're interacting with devices and that gets collected and gets stored in cloud infrastructure, we call them big data.
Just so I understand, how much of that have people explicitly said, yes, you are free to take my data, and how much of it is just taken by use of certain software or whatever?
Yeah, it's kind of a mix because when you're subscribing, so for example, you're subscribing to Amazon Prime or Netflix or streaming services or even Apple devices, when you're downloading app, you have relationships with those businesses. And there are, in many cases, people sign up to be understand that their information has been captured somewhere, aggregated. And then there are instances where some of these platforms and marketing infrastructure would target advertising. So it's a mix of both. And I think that creates the topic of today, like where this big data sits in terms of trust, accuracy, bias, and so on and so forth. And that's a discussion that we're looking to.
Yeah, we'll get to all those issues, but thank you for teeing them up. Susan Paddock, let me bring you in. You're at NORC, which is a very different type of organization. When you think of big data and the sources, what are we talking about for you?
Well, I think of big data as often being a byproduct of a process. It could be a business process, or it could be some other process, such as collecting information on medical conditions from patients or pharmaceutical prescriptions that are dispensed and things like that. And so in the work that we do at NORC, we think about big data along the lines of also thinking about observational data. Sometimes people use that term, or found data or administrative data. And so these data sources are, of course, very compelling and of interest to analysts because there's usually a lot of information in the data, though the information tends to be focused around one particular purpose of the data, that purpose being the purpose for which the data were compiled in the first place.
Okay, but when you say found data, you mean as opposed to like survey data, for example?
A survey data.
So where people are revealing things through their actions or preferences rather than being asked about those actions or preferences.
Yeah, that's correct. Like data that exists out there, and then as an analyst, we approach that data and try to assess, the quality of the data, whether the data are appropriate for how we might, want to use the data.
Yeah. Okay. JP Dubé, you've been on the big question before, talking about what are big data. But just remind us, how do you think about this question?
Well, it's kind of a tough question to answer because I think what we would consider to be big data is evolving over time. But at any given moment in time, I tend to think of big data as a database that somehow pushes the limits of our current technology and requires us to be clever with algorithms of some sort in order to analyze them. So I think historically the term big data originally had to do more with storage, just the sheer quantity of data. This was an artifact of businesses starting to automate and being able to encode numerous kinds of interactions with customers and trade partners that they didn't used to automate. And so these were naturally recorded and just meant your database had lots and lots of rows, and storing all of that data could have been a real challenge. More recently, I think big data sort of changed in terms of which dimension. It's more about the number of columns of data. There's just a lot more stuff I can track about a customer, for example. So big data might not be so much how much I have to store, but how much I have to analyze about a person to really get at some sort of truth or prediction or whatever it may be. And I guess in the background in all of this, there's also been an issue of what do we even consider to be data in the quantitative sense? Historically, things like, well, Mainak, you mentioned images, for example, we might not have really considered quantitative data by their very nature. They weren't encodable, but now with software and other technology, things that we wouldn't have considered data are now considered databases. We can encode colors on a picture, we can encode expressions on somebody's face, we can encode geographic locations combined with a moment in time. So just the sheer numbers of things that we can call data has also pushed the boundaries of our technology.
Mm-hmm. And I said in the introduction that organizations are collecting more and more data. Is it more and more, like, as you said, more different types of data, or is it more in terms of volume, or is it both?
I think it's a combination of the three, that things that I can know about you and encode as data are evolving. Like I said, pictures that you might post online or comments that you might make with slang or other kinds of jargon, all of these can be encoded and called data now. The number of times I can engage with you, that would be getting more into the volume as well. And then, of course, just the number of specific things I can track about you, things that I would have always called data, but I can now see what you bought offline, I can see what you bought online, I can see what you returned, I can sort of track you throughout the entire purchase funnel, and then I can track a customer long after as the relationship with the firm evolves.
Okay, Mainak, big data, is big better? Is bigger better?
It depends. I mean, I think there are definitely advantages of big data. I would call out at least 3, maybe 4 that we consider advantages. One is the details, granularity. So you get pretty much like if you take a picture, image, you get that, to JP's point, tone, color. So anything that can be digitized, you get really a fine granularity and the level of details associated with the action that you're trying to measure. The second is what I would call continuous. This is a big plus or benefit of big data because it's captured by second and second. So if you're trying to do any kind of what I call well-constructed cause and effect, it is more likely you'll find that in big data because you have time dimensions. It's not that in survey you ask something, you go away after a month. A lot of things can happen after a month. Here, if you are really constructing your database and architecture appropriately, you could actually capture the time dimension. And the third is related to the second is timeliness. So if you want real-time updates about traffic, about your analytics, you're serving marketing, and you want to change your campaign because it's not working, you could get that update pretty easily, quickly. And the fourth, it's a little more technical and statistical, it's the idea of variance. When we talk about bias, the variance is one area where we see enormous benefit using big data because you do reduce variances quite a bit compared to a sample or what we historically have used. So I would say that those are the 4 areas where there are benefits, but there are huge challenges as well, which obviously we'll get into it.
Yeah, okay. I'll come to those in just one moment, but just want to get your view on the same question, Susan, this idea of bigger, is bigger better? Because for organizations that maybe don't have the statistical sophistication that you guys have, that are collecting a lot of information about their customers and clients, should they therefore think that the more information they're collecting, the better? Or does it get very noisy? Because in JP's example of just more dimensions might not perhaps lead to more insight.
I think that bigger is not necessarily better, but it can be very useful. So there are certainly some potential disadvantages with big data if the data set doesn't reflect the population that's of interest. That's, for me, number one. Another concern might be there could be millions of data elements, but if those data elements are incomplete or there are reasons why they're not completed accurately, then that can, lead one into trouble. And so that's something worth being careful about. Where I would say big data can be better, and some of the work that we've done is that combining big data with, say, a survey can really be very synergistic for both sources. So, for example, going to Mainak's point about the granularity, it might be that, I can, have a survey of, 10,000 people in various locations, and it represents a well-known population, but some of what I'm interested in might be kind of rare. So, for example, at NORC, we collected data once on allergies, and allergies are rare. So we combined an observational data set on allergies with a survey, and we were able to learn a lot more from that combination of data than we could from either source.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And JP, your view on the same question, that is the larger number of, larger sample size better?
I mean, at some point, I think we run into diminishing returns. I mean, there's a reason why we have sampling theory, and for a lot of questions that businesses need to address, having considerably more observations may not really improve on their ability to reach logical conclusions. What I think a lot of folks overlook is the importance of the quality of how you analyze the data can be just as important as the quantity of data themselves. I'm reminded of a contest about a decade ago run by Netflix to try and see who could make the best prediction algorithm, or the recommendation algorithm for movies, and there was, $1 million prize for this. I'm sure you remember this contest. And for the first week or so, the main competing teams were looking at all sorts of ways to supplement the data they'd been given to get more and more information, and eventually realized that adding more stuff about movies, expert reviews, popularity and things, really hit diminishing returns fast, and that the really big jumps were actually in the quality of how you analyze the existing data and not simply adding more data to an existing algorithm.
Right, which is a really good point. I imagine is very relevant to a lot of organizations, companies that are looking at massive data, that the answer isn't necessarily just to collect more.
Exactly.
Even though that may be heresy at the University of Chicago, because usually we say the answer is to collect more data. Susan Paddock, I wanted to come back to you, this question of trustworthiness that you raised. What makes data sets trustworthy or untrustworthy? What should we be wary of?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think part of the answer depends on how the data will be used. And so it could be that a big data set is very trustworthy for its intended purpose, like, for example, counting how many items are scanned at a supermarket, for example. But if data are used in a way that goes beyond the initial reason, then one can really sort of get into trouble. And so then it's very important to think carefully about how the data elements are being used and interpreted in a data set, in addition to making sure that the data represent the group or the population that one's interested in.
Okay, how about you, Mainak? What about the trustworthiness of data sets?
Yeah, I think that's the heart of the matter here. I think if you take away all the noise outside, if you talk about noise and signals, here is the trust is the key topic that is front and center when it looks at big data. And I'll tell you a couple of things. Like, what we see, we measure, as a Nielsen company, we measure media consumption globally, like what folks are watching on television, on handheld devices, computers, and now large, moving to smart TV. What we see is there's a lot of noise in the data. For example, I'll tell you that sometimes your TV is off, or TV is off, but your set-top box is downloading software. Many cases maybe you're watching a football or World Cup, it's on mute. And if there's an ad coming up when you're on mute, advertisers don't want to pay. They want to pay live audiences. But that's not going to be captured in the mute data, the big data. It will be captured in the TV set. So there are some challenges. And then, our study shows about 20 to 30% of the traffic on the internet can be bots and spiders, which means machine-to-machine traffic. Now, some it's legit because you're going to a page and you are looking for something and they're targeting.
Sorry, just to interrupt, that's across all different kinds of media.
Yeah, it's largely if you take a
we think of like social media as being very much like that.
Yeah, if you take a step back and say take digital globally, about 20 to 30% people on the other side of the screen, they're not people. It's computer to computer, right? And if you're measuring on the client side on the computer, on the screen, on the browser, or add IDs to mobile devices, to her point, you're just going to count, and it's an accurate count, but there may not be a person behind it. So I think the trust goes to how you measure, how you curate the data, and make sure you are organizing your data to answer those questions. Those are very important. And that goes to the whole issue, whole big topic about bias, right? So there's an enormous bias in these data assets. But by the way, they go in both directions. For example, if you're watching a Netflix show, you're watching with your family, but Netflix counts you as one person, right? So you have a co-viewing, so a lot of more people watch those shows, but when you're reporting, you're counting because you have one login ID. And that can be 20, 30% difference in the audience count. Then there are other issues like, how you measure. Are you measuring, for us, are you measuring all the television in the homes? Or you're just measuring one where you have a smart TV and you have a login, that you're getting partial accounting for the number of folks who are watching the show. So there's a lot of biases, and the best way to address this is to have a high quality panel or sample that allows you to really understand, when you bring those two together, you understand the biases. And there are very, very elegant techniques, and JP knows about this as well, that have been developed for the last 10, 15 years that allows you to correct for that. So I think that's very important to the issue of the trust, right? Yeah, to make sure we are correcting for the biases. And some level of independence. You almost need to build something which is orthogonal, which means there's some independence to be able to come in and measure the biases and correct for those biases.
Okay, say more about that. What do you mean by independence?
Independence means, if you are a subscriber, if you're counting your own audiences, and you don't know what's really happening on the other side, there has to be some third-party independence, and that's what Nielsen does. We come in as a third-party independence, and what we try to impart is that trust and quality and transparency in terms of what's happening on those devices.
Could you do that sort of auditing intern?
We get audited. We have agencies that audit us.
Could an organization do that sort of auditing without a third party?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations use internal audits to make sure they're providing right amount of quality and governance around that. But when it happens between buyers and sellers, you need a third party to validate that. That validation piece is very important. That goes to the trust.
JP Dubé, how do you think about the issue of trust and how organizations should be guided to what data sets are most trustworthy?
So one of the big problems is, of course, the pros and cons of using technology. The key is scalability. Using technology, we've been able to scale up samples to dimensions we'd never imagined were possible before. So with NORC, you're interested in surveys, we can build up lists of potential survey populations in the millions, which is terrific. It helps us start measuring rare populations that we would have never been able to survey before. So imagine you want to do a survey of pregnant mothers, but now you want a survey of pregnant mothers who buy a very obscure brand of a product from a marketer. It actually might be possible to generate a sufficiently sized subsample of those mothers buying that specific brand. The challenge is that that same technology that scales up the size of that survey makes it difficult to maintain quality control. So there's arbitrage. We have companies and individuals who are using software to get paid to be part of these survey samples who aren't really answering the surveys for you. So how do you screen out this software? How do you screen out bots? You have fraudsters of other kinds, people who try to create multiple identities. People are strategic sometimes on surveys. One of the main criticisms I've heard of the Amazon Turk panel is that sometimes respondents talk to each other while they're completing the surveys. So there's background strategies going on. In a world where we were manually collecting these surveys, you would have one-on-one interaction with your respondent. It was easy to rule these things out. But in a world where we're scaling up the collection of the data with technology, it becomes very difficult to rely on traditional measures of trust or traditional measures to ensure trust in the quality of the data.
Mm-hmm. So we're starting to get into some of the flaws, but just before we dive deeper into that, is there such a thing as objective data, big data?
Objective big data, that's a loaded question. I'll leave it at that. No, look, if you think of it, if you design an architected system in a machine or software, it tells you what, it gives you what you're designing it for. So the reason I say it's loaded because that's what it's supposed to do, but the question is as a practitioner, how you're going to use it. And I think that's where the objectivity, the scientific inquiry and the frameworks.
So it's in as what goes back to what JP was saying, it's in the process of analysis that often the errors creep in.
And I think Susan started the discussion saying something important, that these are exhaust. They're not, this data gets created because they're doing something else. It's not designed to measure or designed to do certain things after the fact. So what happens is you really have to understand the purpose of how it was designed, why it was collected. And once you do that, then you could start addressing the biases and make it more objective. But as it stands, I think it just counts and it gives you the information that you are originally designed it for, right?
But is there something more objective about found data, for example?
No, I mean, I think Mainak covered it really well, just in terms of thinking about the objectivity along with the analysis and how the data are going to be used and being able to make judgments about the data quality. It's important.
I mean, one of the things I know that you're concerned about is the incentives that organizations that collect data have and how those incentives might themselves shape the data sets. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is becoming more important. I mean, one thing that we started learning a little bit is that, you know, when you collect that software, these platforms and machines and devices collecting big data, they're also making decisions based on your behavior. And that decision loop gets ingrained into the machine learning for next targeting, next personalization, next delivery, next merchandising, right? What we're seeing is there might be a divergence going on between intent as a consumer and what these AI and big data is providing. So that's the reason I think the incentives and best practices are important to make sure there's a Venn diagram. There's an overlap of, there's convergence as opposed to divergence. And increasingly what we see is a lot of these big algorithmic types of services are diverging from what actually was supposed to measure. So best practices would be, have some level of governance around that. Internally governance, best way to label the data, curate, understanding the quality. There's a whole field that is coming up called model operations. You will hear it called model ops, where you have all these machine learning models, you have KPIs, so the model doesn't drift. So you have a confidence interval, and you make sure that models actually stays within the confidence interval. And if there's a drift, you go back and address that. So there are some, what I call governance structure and frameworks that's coming into the marketplace that we feel are very, right, it's going in the right direction. The other would be, I still feel that, and I think both JP and Susan touched upon, there has to be some level of human validation. And you talk about MTurk, but also customer reviews, right? There has to be some level of human validation that it is Hal who's watching the show, it is JP who's writing the reviews, or it is Susan who said certain things. So that level of validation is important, and I think there are a lot of services out in the marketplace, including the companies which are collecting a lot of data to build that, and I think that's an opportunity definitely for a lot of companies. And we see that happening, but I think it'll be better if it's happening industry-wide.
Mm-hmm. JP, are you also concerned about the incentives that organizations have in collecting data?
Oh, very concerned. And this ties back to the question of objectivity. Let's take an example. Let's suppose that I'm providing advertising services for a client, and the client's interested in whether or not more advertising would increase how many sales they get. So one way we could do this is to track how many people click on the ad. You might be able to even track how many people get to their website, but ultimately what we really care about is whether or not people spend money and whether or not the ads cause more sales. Well, it's really hard with most settings to link an individual exposure to an ad to a final sale. It's a lot easier on the internet, for example, just to see if someone clicked on an ad. So you could objectively track who clicks and who doesn't click, but then subjectively call a click a purchase. We'll say, we'll call that a success. And this is where things get a little tricky if the client on the other side of this doesn't understand that the thing you called a purchase wasn't actually a purchase. I mean, this takes us back, but in 1998 or 1997, they used to keep track of what are the most clicked websites, and then we'd talk about eyeballs, and one of the most popular websites for 1 week only was out of nowhere. I forget what it was, but something no one would have been interested in. It turned out they'd run a very early stage banner ad campaign, a display ad campaign, saying party naked. So hundreds of millions of people clicked on these ads, and of course the website for 1 week had an enormous amount of traffic, but that didn't have anything to do with any interest in the website or a purchase. So you can see how by taking a click, which is objectively measured as a click, but subjectively interpreted as a purchase, could misrepresent how effective an ad campaign was.
And so that goes back to what you said about the methodology of analysis, but also to do with the repackaging and selling on of data. That this whole
I just to add, I think the concept of consumer and audience and person is very, very important. What we're talking about is machine traffic, right? Traffic from devices, software and with in cloud infrastructure, you've got collecting massive amount of data passively, actively. But if you don't put the person in the center, a lot of this trust, objectivity goes away. And I think that's what, ultimately, all this validation and trust requires people to design this to make sure there are people into the mix. Otherwise, you'd start designing things that's not going to work.
Okay, we'll come back to some more solutions in a second, but I want to dig into Susan Paddock a little bit more into the biases that get built into data sets and then perhaps amplified in big data sets. What are the biases that can creep in?
Well, one bias that I always think about off the top is the coverage bias. Is the group or the population I'm interested in represented by the data? That's a huge way to obtain biased results if that's not the case. Other biases can be embedded in the data, especially depending on how people use the data. So a couple of years ago, there was a report that came out from a Harvard group about a healthcare prediction algorithm in which the goal was to predict how much care people would need to use. And they included expenditures as a predictor variable. Well, that has a lot of bias, a lot of racial bias in particular, and that's what they highlighted. And so one has to really think hard about how the data are being used in these cases in order to make, to avoid as many biases as possible.
Mainak, what do you think are some of the biases that are most common that you see in big data sets?
I think the coverage is important, right? For example, or what do you see? People would jump to conclusion based on streaming. But streaming is pay to play. You have to actually subscribe. Not everybody has money to subscribe to 20 different streaming services. So if you start generalizing the audience behavior of media consumption based on a couple of streaming platforms, you're wrong, right? Then biases about completeness in the measurement. Like, for example, when we measure all the TVs, all the devices within the home or with a person. And that's important because you move from one device to the other. And that completeness in the sample is very, very critical. And the third is the person itself. And I still, want to double click on this point is that the person is very important when we are measuring consumer audiences. If we don't account for that, if there's a person really can be validated, you usually end up getting biased and wrong information. As I said, big data is extremely good in variance. So it reduces the variability of your estimates that you can get out of sampling. But bias is where I think there's a lot of work needs to be done.
Okay, and JP?
Yeah, the kind of bias I'm most concerned about, I'm going to call activity bias. It's not a term I came up with. It was coined by some economists at Yahoo back in the day. But when it pertains to these found data, as we were describing earlier, if I'm just tracking people's behavior online, and I'm going to use my advertising example again, I'm interested in whether or not advertising exposure causes higher sales, the natural activity bias is going to bias who actually gets seen those ads. So then the found data, the kind of person who's the most likely to expose to a digital ad is somebody who uses the web a lot. And it may very well be the kind of person who spends an inordinate amount of time on the web is going to be a lot more likely to shop at a place that uses a lot of digital advertising. And you could give yourself the illusion that digital advertising is really effective because it's highly correlated with exposure, like sales are highly correlated with exposure. even though the exposure was really an artifact of the kind of person buying online, also sees a lot of digital ads. And so the bias I have in mind here is that the found data are usually not very effective for answering questions about what causes what, and amplifying one of these found databases from the millions of people to the billions of people isn't going to solve that problem.
Okay, very quickly, I want to get each of you to give us one thing that an organization can do maybe to address some of these biases. Mainak?
Yeah, I think that there has to be some independent validation of the data. And the second would be data governance. Have a better data governance around the infrastructure and quality.
Okay, Susan?
I think as a statistician, I'll say having people who are trained in study design and sampling on the team can be very helpful, because even if the data don't arise from a sample or a study design that's really well known, at least understanding, what sort of an ideal design would be is really helpful for sort of diagnosing issues with big data.
Right. And JP?
For companies that are trying to figure out what causes what, run experiments. Randomized controlled experiments. They're going to be a lot more informative than relying on observational or found data.
Excellent. Well, it seems like a great point on which to end it. This has been a fascinating discussion. My thanks to our panel, JP Dubé, Mainak Mazumdar, and Susan Paddock. For more research, analysis, and commentary, visit us online at chicagobooth.edu/review, and join us again next time for another big question. And a special thank you to all of you who have joined us for the past hour online. I hope you've enjoyed this stream. My thanks to our partners at the Kilt Center for Marketing at Chicago Booth and to Nielsen.